Ravines is a community for me as well. So when I go there to visit Dad, I'm seeing people that I know who work there, other residents, and it's all part of a community where you don't feel you're going through it on your own.
Hi, I'm Agnes Stowicki, Managing Editor with Comfort Life. We're speaking with insiders from Canada's leading retirement communities and care providers to uncover insights to community lifestyle, care, culture, and leadership. This includes insights from residents, family members, and administration. This is the Comfort Life Insider Perspective.
There's lots of things that I appreciate about the Ravines, Brian, but I think I thought about this quite a bit. And I think the most important thing, most significant benefit for me as a caregiver for Dad is that I feel that Ravines is a community for me as well. So when I go there to visit Dad, I'm seeing people that I know who work there, other residents, and it's all part of a community where you don't feel you're going through it on your own. And that's really a big plus, a big benefit for me. After he'd been at the Ravines for about a year, he went into the independent living section. To be honest, I think he was probably somewhere in between the two buildings. There's an independent building, which is really like an apartment where you're pretty free to do your own thing, although the meals are provided and some recreation. And then the other building is really for people who need some form of hospital care or nursing care. So when Dad first went in, he was certainly having some challenges with his memory, but he was physically healthy and so on and so forth. So at the beginning, he was getting used to it, adjusting generally, but then he had a fall. So when that happened, he was in the hospital for about 2 months. And we knew that when he came back from the hospital, there was no way he was able to go back to the independent building, either physically because he needed more support that way, or cognitively, he was having more trouble with his memory. So it was so nice from that time when he came out of the hospital to know that he had a place to go to in the same facility, and we'd be dealing with the same staff members and the same management team. That was and convenient to where we lived. That was so convenient, that transition from the hospital to more care compared with where he was before. That I appreciated a great deal. Dad's not really, compared with my mom, he's not really that social a person. So he would pick and choose what he'd want to go to. But I'll give you one example of something that's been very meaningful to him since he's been there. When we were growing up, Dad attended church with our family, but as he got older, he was less involved, and I think he was less comfortable with things at church like guitars, things that were a bit more modern. He was more of a traditionalist that way, and so kind of shied away from church. When we got to the Ravines, one of the activities that I noticed was a hymn sing, and I knew Dad liked to sing, but when I realized it was going to be a person playing the guitar and singing hymns, I thought, Dad's not going to go for this. So we walked by the chapel, and I said, "What do you think, Dad? Should we go in and just give it a try?" And he didn't say no. So we went in together, and it was a fellow from Rwanda, actually a refugee from Rwanda he'd been a refugee and gone to England and become a minister. Anyway, he was there playing hymns on his guitar. I was really surprised that Dad stayed the first time, but he did because he was playing songs that Dad knew well and loved. And because of the group that was there was probably a dozen people in the little chapel. And we went back week after week. It was every Friday. And you could tell that Dad was really comfortable with Fidel as a minister, as a person that he could relate to, but also comfortable with that little group of regulars that would come every week. And 4 years later, Brian, we're still going to that service. It happened sporadically during the lockdowns because the minister couldn't come into the retirement home, but we did some of them on the screen. But now he's back again coming in, and he's become a friend, and some of the other people have become close friends. So that's been a great social activity for Dad, who ordinarily isn't a person to do a lot of socializing. The interesting thing, you think of the staff in a place like that, you think first of the nurses, or you think first of the the management, and they're all good. I can talk more about Sam, who's the general manager later, but I think the people, the people that I deal with most, it's the PSWs who are the ones that are doing the hands-on work with Dad every day and probably know him best. And there's some really, in my opinion, some outstanding people, just because, and I'm not talking about their knowledge or the equipment that they have, that's good too, but it's because they care. And they'll often take an interest, take some time to talk to me about how Dad's doing. And I think they're genuinely interested, and that makes all the difference to me to know that there's people like that really are the ones that are with Dad most of the time. And the other group of people that I've appreciated a lot is the front desk people. Again, not the most heralded job, but how they kept everything going. They're sort of like the hub, right? They're taking calls from us, or if we come in, they've got to make sure we've got the right equipment on. And then they're managing that with calls from residents and calls from some of the staff members. They're keeping everything going. And those people, the ones that have worked at the Ravines, unfailingly polite and calm amidst a whirlwind of activity. So they also do all the bookings if I'm coming in for a visit, and let me know about regulations that are changing. So I talk to them a lot, and they've been a great support as well. So particularly nurses and PSWs. And then talking about Sam, the general manager, I can't say enough about him as a person. He was actually the chef there, the head chef when Dad started. He was a darn good chef too, but his main skill is the people, relating to keeping us informed, but also just talking over things with us. But he's always involved talking with residents, maybe just a short conversation, but he makes a connection there. So people know him and trust him. And I remember saying to him, Sam, how do you do it? How do you keep that good group of staff together? And he said, my way of running a place like that is maybe a little different philosophy. He said, the most important thing for me is actually the staff. He says, if I can keep good people and keep them motivated and happy, then all the benefits for the residents will flow from that. Now that's a very interesting observation or philosophy in managing, and it certainly seems to work there. I'll say something at the beginning that might be unusual for people to hear, but Betty and I are volunteers with a choir of blind people, and we go around and sing with the choir in retirement homes and nursing homes in Ottawa from January to June. So we've seen a lot. I mean, we've probably seen several dozen nursing and retirement homes just coming in to sing for them. And it's an interesting conclusion from all of that. What the physical appearance of the building has little to do. There's no strong correlation between what the building looks like and how content or how happy the people are who live in there. It's not so much the building, Brian. It's really who works there and what kind of activities they have going, what kind of volunteer program, how the families are involved. It's really that kind of thing that's important. So having said all that, but the building really isn't the end all be all. I would say the facilities at the Ravines are excellent. Was probably built about 10 or 12 years ago, one building more recent than the other, but so physically they're clean, they're relatively new buildings, things work. And for me, maybe the nicest part of the facilities is where it is, the location. It's called the Ravines because it's actually along the valley of a little creek that runs into the Rideau River in Ottawa. So we love, and Dad loves to go for a walk now in his wheelchair along that creek to see the trees and the rabbits and the people walking their dogs and all the different ages. There's a playground nearby with kids. So the community that was developed by the person who owns the Ravines was actually an integrated community. So the same developer built the townhouses where the young families live, and he built the playgrounds, and he built the retirement home, and some offices, doctors' offices, and dentists. So somebody's been thinking about how that whole thing fits together, and I think it has benefited Dad because he sees people of different generations. He's not just, closeted with a group of senior citizens all the time. So that's a big part of the facility too. He's in, so right now he's in the section that requires the most care. So he needs some physical care, but there's also, Dad has memory challenges. So he's on what I would think would be called their Alzheimer's wing or their memory care wing. And for him, that was really, it was a tough decision in some ways, but I think it was, as time has gone on, it was a really good location for Dad at this stage in his life. When the lockdown started about 1.5 or 2 years ago, Dad was in a room, not in the independent suites, but in the building where you get some care, but maybe a relatively minor amount of care. But when the lockdown started, people had to stay in their rooms, and Dad just didn't understand. It was too hard for him to really understand why he had to stay in his room. So it was very frustrating for him. And we decided, why don't we move him down to the memory care floor, because it has its own dining room there. It has people's individual rooms, but there's a very large, I would say like a living room, that it's a common space. So there was no restriction with people coming out of their rooms and into that living space for those people. And there might be 10 or 12 people on that floor. So they made a special exception for those people being able to circulate, just because it would be very difficult for them to understand staying in their own room. And that was a real benefit for Dad, I think, to have that freedom to move around. And so that's probably the maximum amount of care where Dad is now, which is what he needs. But when he first went in, he had the minimum amount of care, and that was his own room, and he could make some of his own meals. He did his own laundry, he had a little washing machine, and he had his own shower. So all of those things, just like a nice apartment, really is where he started. And then as he's needed more care, there was other types of rooms where there was more nursing care available, until the other extreme is where he is now. So I think both ends of the spectrum there were good for Dad at the time. I think on the improvement side, at the beginning, it was a bit of a challenge, because he was moving from his home of 60 years into a new environment. Most of the people he didn't know. So it was adjusting to the people, adjusting to the environment. And in Dad's case, the biggest change was not being able to drive anymore. And that happened before he moved. But I think of all the adjustments, that was the biggest. So it was a hard time for Dad, a difficult time. But he made the decision to go. We talked about it. He made the decision to go. And once he made that decision, he tried his best to adjust. Although I would say it probably took 2 or 3 months to really feel that he got to know people and got to know the facilities there and the activities that were available. So it took a while. But once he got to know those people, the biggest advantage was he wasn't on his own. He wasn't by himself. Mom died about 20 years ago, and he was, for those 20 years, he was in their home, living on his own. He had lots of good neighbors, and it was a very close-knit community, but still, as time went on, some of those neighbors got sick and had to move. So it was going from a place where he was becoming more and more isolated to a place where he had, he was surrounded by people at meals and in the activity. So that was a big improvement there. When he came back from the hospital after breaking his hip, he really needed a lot of care. And I think if he had been going back to his original room, or certainly if he'd been going back home, that would have been very, very challenging to get the care that he needed at that point in time, especially given the lockdown and all the difficulties in getting help with assistance at home at that time. So that was, on both of those fronts, that was an improvement for Dad. Although, as I say at the beginning, it was still an adjustment for him. His health, physical and mental, has declined. So in a way, his quality of life has declined just because of the aging process. But having said that, given the situation he's in physically and cognitively now, I think he's in a place where he's got care available as he needs it, and also a community available as he needs it. If he was at home with us, we would be able to provide some of that, and maybe provide it in a different way in terms of a family connection. But it's really just Betty and I. My other siblings live elsewhere, and so we really couldn't provide 24/7 care. And I remember when mom also had Alzheimer's about 20 years ago, Dad tried to do that in the home for her, and he tried very hard, but it was a 24/7 job, and it just wore him out. And that was part of our thinking when we thought about Dad going to the retirement home. So I think that's been that's made his life better because there's more people to help, put it simply. Certainly overall, it would be nice if he wasn't aging and could stay the way he was 20 years ago, but that just isn't the fact physically. So given that there's been physical changes and cognitive changes, I think what's improved is the number of people that are there to help him. Again, I'd say for me, it's a community. It's not just a community for Dad, but it's a community for me as a caregiver. And I think other caregivers feel that way, that when we go there, of course, it's sometimes discouraging just to be reminded that your dad's getting older and more frail. But there's almost always somebody to share a story with, or they'll have noticed something with Dad during the week that was encouraging. I got to know the other residents. You've been going there 4 years, so there's a number of characters there that are very, very interesting personalities. When we see somebody getting older, we see an older person, we often tend to think of them as just a person at the end of their life, but they've had very interesting lives. Many of the people there, maybe probably all of the people there, have had interesting lives. So the ones that I've got to know a little bit, that's been a benefit to me, purely from a selfish point of view, to get to know some new friends. And so when I'm going there, it's not just to see Dad, it's to, connect with some of these friends again on the staff as well as the resident side. One of the PSWs who I like the most, I would say, got to know him a bit, and it turns out he's from Haiti, the island of Haiti. And I said, Patrick, what did you do when you were in Haiti? And it turns out he was a tailor, and he actually was responsible for a large factory or a large manufacturing company where they made clothes, and they had several hundred people on sewing machines. So Patrick had this whole other life. And then there was lots of political problems there. So he came to first the United States, then to Canada, and he ended up as a PSW, but he's a great PSW. And so there's a bit of a connection there with Patrick because I know a little bit more about him. And there's several other staff members that I could say the same thing about there. So, and Dad knows some of these people and knows a little bit about them. There's one guy in particular who's the guy who fixes things at the Ravines. His name's Phil, and Phil is, he owned his own body shop before. So Dad liked cars, and so they would talk about cars, or Dad would go down to his shop, his repair shop there downstairs, and just watch him with the equipment, because Dad was an engineer, so he used to like to fix things in his workshop. Well, Phil would talk to him about those kinds of things. So he related to him in a completely different way than the actual health concerns. So I guess that's an improvement for Dad, to have those kinds of people in his life that he can talk to about things that aren't related to healthcare or getting older, to kind of break out of that mold. Yeah, it was just taking the responsibility away that was a sole responsibility of mine, and not having all the skills or the background to really be able to deal with some of the physical and memory changes that were happening, to take all of that responsibility from my shoulders and to distribute it. So when I go there, there's a lot of people that know more than me and can help with medical concerns or to help with memory care. Whereas when I go to see Dad, I'm just relating to him as my dad. And so we can talk, or we can have some fun, or have a catch, or go to the hymn sing, or whatever, go for a walk. Those are the things we do. And I remember with Mom, when Dad was looking after Mom, it was the same kind of thing. When he had the sole responsibility, especially at night, he was really getting worn down. When Mom went to a retirement home, all of a sudden, when he went to visit her, he was rested and he was looking forward to it. And so the time they had was good time, rather than just him being tired out. And, anyway, so that the same thing has happened for me, I would say. I would look around just to see what was available. And I wouldn't look at just the places that have the nicest buildings or the fanciest facilities, because as time goes on, the actual range of facilities becomes less important to the resident. I think their life becomes smaller in a lot of ways, but I would ask if you can talk to some of the other families would be the best thing to see what they think of the Ravines or another place. I would consider location as being an important factor. How far away is it from the caregivers? How often can they get there? Because really one of the biggest factors in Dad's quality of life is how often he sees family and good friends. So that's another factor. But certainly the Ravines, our experience with the Ravines being close and having that kind of a staff and facilities and location, I can't think of anything that could be much better, really, in our case. If I was living in the other side of town, it might be different, but we have had experiences with other nursing homes and retirement homes through friends and through my mom. And I haven't seen one that's better than the Ravines, to be honest. Yes, I'd say try to, as much as possible, try to keep the person who's involved informed and involved in the decisions. Of course, it might depend on how they understood the whole picture, you know, whether they even realized what their needs were or how they were changing. That might not be so apparent to the person going through it. But I think in Dad's case, he was and still is in some ways, a very independent person, capable of making good decisions, used to making decisions. So if we were to have excluded him from all of that, I think that would have been not a good idea. So he was interested in everything that we gathered about the retirement homes and trying to make that decision. And I think he felt he was part of it. And he was certainly more capable of being part of those decisions at that point in time 4 years ago than he would be now. When he came back from the hospital, I think if we had asked him, he wouldn't have understood that he needed more care, but he did. So as I'm his caregiver and his power of attorney, you know, as well. So you realize it's hard with a person like Dad because he's a person I thought and still do think so highly of. It's a bit uncomfortable in a way to, as a son of a person you've admired and had as a mentor growing up, to be making decisions for them, or the table's being reversed, or all of a sudden you're the parent and they're the child in a way. So I found that transition hard, and it was, yeah, it took some getting used to, Brian, but I would say to the extent the person's able to be involved, it's good to keep them involved in making the decision. Then when when the move is actually happening, they understand why, or at least they understand to some extent why, and they buy into it, even though there was still a transition period. Remember John Patterson telling me, the previous manager there, he said, Peter, give yourself or give your dad 3 months from the time that they move there to really give them a chance to get their feet wet and get used to it. There's going to be a period where they feel they question the decision, they wonder if they should have left home, and that was certainly true. But I think John's advice was very good. And then after that period, you could see Dad starting to fit in with more people. He knew the routines, and that was all good. And I think the other advice that really has nothing to do with retirement homes, but if you've been in a house for 60 years like Dad had been, there's a lot of stuff to deal with. Well, Dad and I actually looked at 3 retirement homes in more detail. The facilities, the cost, all of them had we were looking for some form of care that ranged from independent to requiring more care. We were looking for that so that if something happened, as it did with his hip, we knew that the same facility would have the additional facilities available, even though he didn't know them at the beginning. So that was another thing we were looking at. Cost was a factor, but like I say, the costs were relatively similar, not that much difference. I don't think we looked a lot at other than the medical facilities, I don't think we looked a lot at the recreation, although that actually tended to be quite important in Dad's case. What facilities were available, what kinds of activities did they have, even though he wasn't a particularly social person. He's really enjoyed some of the activities and they've been good for him. So all those factors were involved. And I think in the end, one of the people that he knew at the Ravines was probably the deciding factor, because there was a person he would know if he moved there. So that was probably tipping the balance a bit there at the end. But we also got to know that the manager at the Ravines, who isn't the manager there now, his name was I think of his first name, doesn't matter. He was a fellow from New Brunswick, and Dad's a good guy. And he was a fellow from New Brunswick, Dad's from New Brunswick, and they would talk a lot about the province and fishing holes. And Dad was a marine engineer, so they talked about the coast. And so they related well to each other. And so I think because his name was John Patterson, John and Dad would talk, they had a good rapport, and he could answer the questions Dad had about the ravines. I think John was probably an important factor there too. No, I think it was just something that Dad gradually came to the realization that it would probably be wise to move. You know, probably what precipitated it all, he hadn't had a fall at that point. I certainly noticed changes at home. You know, he was an engineer, so he was used to doing a lot of repairs on his own and really knew, you know, carpentry and electrical stuff much better than I did. And what was happening was the tables were turning there. I was the one he was relying on for that, those kinds of things. So I realized things were changing there. But the biggest thing was probably not being able to drive anymore. And that was a cognitive issue that his doctor picked up on, thank goodness, because I don't think Dad would have stopped driving. But when Dad realized that he couldn't drive anymore, all of a sudden the attractiveness of staying at home wasn't there nearly as strongly. So then we looked around for choices and narrowed it down to these three, and we visited each of them. And like I said, they were fairly comparable, but maybe because of his knowledge, his friendship, and knowing John Patterson at the Ravines quite well, the fact that one of his friends was there, that maybe tipped the balance. No, I mean, he liked we both liked the setting there by the river, and that ended up being something that Dad really enjoyed, because he'd go for walks there when he could walk. When he was more mobile, he'd go for walks there every morning, so that was really a bonus. But you know, when we were trying to decide, it was funny. He actually thought he might prefer the location right on Maryville Road, right on the main artery, and the reason was he wanted to be able to walk to the shops and, you know, look around what was going on, go into a little coffee shop and get a snack or a coffee. He wanted the mixture of people. So for some people, maybe it'd be better to be closer to that kind of activity. But I think in the end, certainly from a safety point of view, from the caregiver point of view, you know, the thought of Dad crossing Maryville, I don't know if you know Maryville Road, very busy road in Ottawa. The thought of Dad crossing Maryville Road on his own to go shopping, that wouldn't have been good at that stage. So I was very glad when he decided on the Ravines, but I'm not sure the natural environment was the key factor for Dad, although since he's moved there, it's become something he's really enjoyed. So in retrospect, that would have been a factor that we would have weighed more heavily, although at the time, I don't think we really were thinking that far ahead. Yeah, that could have been a much more difficult process than it was. And the simple thing that helped us there, the single thing that helped us most, Brian, was a company that specializes in moving seniors. And they came in and talked to Dad and I, first of all, just their attitude with Dad. they made him feel like they wanted him to be in charge of that process. They really deferred to him when they had decisions to make about how many things he should bring, what kind of furniture he wanted to bring. Those were really up to Dad. He felt like he had the freedom to make those decisions. Of course, in the end, 90% of the stuff in the house could not be taken to the retirement home. So once we decided, Dad spent quite a bit of time deciding what he wanted to take, and they were very helpful about what they thought. They knew the layout of the room and how much space we had. They had all kinds of experience and what would work and what would probably fit. So once he knew what he wanted to take, which was a relatively small amount of stuff, getting rid of the other 90% was something I would have been would have taken me a long time. I would have really struggled with that. And they probably did that whole exercise in about 2 days. I couldn't believe it. I thought it was going to be 2 or 3 weeks, even with them. But they had all kinds of connections with the people who do the recycling. They had all kinds of connections with the furniture people. They sold some of the furniture for us. And cleaning. They did the cleaning. They cleaned out the house and cleaned the house so it was ready to be sold, honestly, within 2 days. And I still shake my head at how they ever did that. I mean, Dad wasn't he didn't have piles and piles of stuff, and he was a neat person, but still there was an awful lot of, and most of the family didn't want that stuff. You know, all the kids are older now, and so there might have been sentimental attachments to some of the furniture, but we really didn't need it. So it was getting rid of that 90%. And I would say it's so important, if you're able to, get a company involved that can help you with that if you don't have a lot of people to help. And also the cost was much more reasonable than I expected, far less than the cost of selling the house, of course, I guess, but it was something like $1,500, and the amount of work that they saved us in clearing out the stuff in the house, selling it or recycling it, and then cleaning it, preparing it to be sold was phenomenal. It was the best decision we ever made.
And how did the Ravines make that transition easier? Was there a pleasant surprise during or after your dad had moved in?
I guess we knew John. John was the manager there at the time, and he made a special effort to welcome Dad, and Dad knew him. So that was important because there wasn't a lot of familiar faces. So John was a key link. And there was also, as I said, another friend of Dad's who was living there. So I think those two people helped the most. But I remember one lady who we've got to know subsequently, but we were down in the storage room moving stuff in, and I was probably lost. I'd forgotten what door you used or what key you used. I forget what it was, but Margaret happened to be coming along the hallway. So she doesn't work at the Ravine, she's just a resident. But then this was over in the independent wing. Margaret says, "Can I help you with anything?" And I must have explained the situation. Oh, she says, "Oh yeah, no problem. I've got a locker in there too." So she took us in, navigated us around. And whatever it was that she said, and I don't even remember the details, she just made us feel like, okay, here's a person who's willing to help, if we're confused and feel a bit lost, like of course you would at the beginning. There was somebody who was quite happy to help us, and she's been a kind person and a friend ever since. So that little connection with Margaret that we didn't expect or plan was very nice too. Not a lot. I mentioned it a little earlier, but I think if I'd known about resources like the ones your company offers, where you can get maybe a bigger picture of the range of facilities available in the community, different retirement homes and what they offer, and getting it from a neutral source rather than just reading the brochure from the retirement homes, I think that's good. Although I wouldn't change, I probably wouldn't change the fact that we chose a retirement home in the community. That's been a big benefit, to be closer to Dad and for him to be closer to his friends and family. No, I don't know if I would have changed a lot. We also would have looked for a place where there was a transition from independent to needing more care. That was certainly important. And getting Dad involved in the process, if he felt he was part of that too. It wasn't great planning on my part, or that I knew all the answers beforehand. We kind of stumbled into it, but maybe if I had a few more resources to look at what was out there, it might have helped a lot. Brian, in the end, I don't know if the decision we ended up with was could have been much better. Not necessarily all because of our planning or our experience, but just the way it worked out. So I feel very fortunate.
For more information about this community, you can visit their profile at comfortlife.ca.